Ice crystals scraped against the observation window like 1,000 tiny claws. David Reed pressed his hand against the reinforced glass, feeling the cold seep through despite the triple-layered protection. Outside, the world had turned into a swirling mass of white and gray, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. He had been on Valthor for 2 years now, studying the impossible weather patterns of this frozen moon. The ice storms here did not follow any logical progression. They appeared without warning, grew to monstrous size within minutes, and could strip metal from bone if you were foolish enough to be caught outside. The local wildlife had adapted over millions of years, developing thick hides and the instinct to burrow deep when the wind began to sing its warning song. But the albino dragons were different. They were not native to this place. They had come here 3 generations ago, seeking isolation after their kind had been hunted nearly to extinction. These magnificent creatures with scales like fresh snow and eyes like pale sapphires had chosen the harshest environment they could find. Here, among the endless ice fields and crystal caves, they could raise their young away from the collectors and trophy hunters who valued their rare coloring above their lives. David had spent months earning their tolerance. Not trust, he understood that much. The dragons watched him with ancient intelligence, accepting his presence near their territory but never inviting him closer. He kept detailed records of their behavior, their migration patterns between caves, the way they hunted the ice seals that lived beneath the frozen ocean. He never approached their nests. He never tried to touch them. He simply observed and documented, and slowly, the dragons stopped fleeing when they saw him in the distance. The largest of them, a female he had named Snowmane in his private notes, had even allowed him within 50 meters of her position once. She had regarded him with those unsettling pale eyes. Her head tilted slightly as if trying to understand what kind of creature would willingly live in such a hostile place. Then she had turned away, dismissing him as neither threat nor interest. Now watching the storm build to unprecedented fury, David felt his stomach clench with worry. His instruments had detected something wrong with this system 6 hours ago. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 20 minutes. The wind speeds were already beyond anything he had recorded. And the worst part, the thing that made his hands shake as he checked his readings again and again, was that the storm had formed directly over the dragon nesting grounds. Through the howling wind, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sound he had only heard once before, during his first month on Valthor, when a young dragon had been injured in a fall. It was a cry of distress, high and piercing, cutting through even the storm's rage. It was followed by deeper calls, adult dragons bellowing in panic and anger. David ran to his equipment locker and began pulling on his survival suit. The advanced gear was designed to keep a human alive in Valthor's environment for up to 8 hours, with heating elements, oxygen recycling, and emergency beacons built into every layer. His hands fumbled with the seals as another cry echoed across the ice. The rational part of his brain, the part that had earned him 3 degrees and a position on this remote research station, told him that going out into that storm was suicide. The survival suit was rated for normal Valthor conditions, not for storms like this. He would be flash frozen within an hour. His body would not be found until spring, if ever. The research company would list him as another casualty of extreme environment studies, a statistic in their safety reports. But the sound of those cries pulled at something deeper than rationality. David sealed his helmet and checked his power levels. Full charge. 8 hours of heat, maybe 9 if he was careful. He grabbed the emergency supply pack and clipped it to his belt, then activated the magnetic grips on his boots. The airlock door opened, and the storm tried to rip him off his feet immediately. The wind hit him like a physical wall, and for a moment he could not move forward or back. Ice particles peppered his faceplate, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The temperature reading on his display dropped so fast it seemed broken. -60, -70, -80 degrees. David forced himself forward 1 step at a time. The magnetic boots helped, locking him to any metal surface, but between the station and the dragon caves there was only ice and rock. He had to lean into the wind at a 45-degree angle, just to avoid being blown backward. His breathing echoed loud inside the helmet, fast and harsh with fear and exertion. The dragon calls were closer now. Through brief gaps in the swirling white, he caught glimpses of movement, large shapes pale against the snow moving frantically near the cave entrances. And then he saw something that made him forget the cold entirely. 3 small forms, much too small, were being pushed away from the caves by the force of the wind. The hatchlings caught in the open when the storm hit, unable to fight their way back to safety. The adult dragons were trying to reach them, but even these powerful creatures could not fly in winds this strong. Snowmane herself was fighting forward, her claws tearing gouges in the ice as she struggled against the storm. But she was being pushed back away from her young, and David could see the moment when she realized the truth. The hatchlings were going to be swept away, carried into the deep ice fields where even dragons could not survive. David did not think. He simply moved. His legs carried him toward the small struggling forms, his suit's targeting system locking onto their heat signatures. Behind him, through the storm's scream, he thought he heard a different sound, a dragon's cry, but not of distress, of something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or disbelief. The hatchlings disappeared into a wall of white, and David ran after them into the killing storm. White filled everything. David could not tell up from down, could not see his own hands in front of his faceplate. The wind pushed him sideways, then spun him around, and for several terrifying seconds he lost all sense of direction. His suit's computer flashed warnings across his vision. External temperature critical, power consumption elevated. Recommended action, seek immediate shelter. He ignored it all and focused on the 3 blinking dots on his heads-up display. The suit's thermal sensors had locked onto the hatchlings before they vanished into the storm. Now those sensors were the only thing connecting him to 3 small lives that were running out of time. The dots were moving fast, being pushed by the wind like leaves in a hurricane. David adjusted his course and pushed forward. The ice beneath his feet was smooth, polished by centuries of wind. His magnetic boots were useless here. He fell twice in the first 5 minutes, the impacts jarring his bones even through the suit's padding. The second time he went down, something sharp tore across his left leg. A warning light flashed. Minor breach detected in lower left section. Seal holding at 80% integrity. Estimated time to failure, 4 hours. 4 hours was now his deadline. 4 hours to find the hatchlings, get them to safety, and return to the station. In a storm that should have kept him pinned inside for days. David laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in his helmet. When he had applied for this position, the recruiter had said he was looking for someone comfortable with challenging environments. This seemed to go a bit beyond challenging. The thermal dots were slowing down. David increased his pace, fighting through drifts that came up to his waist. His legs burned with effort, his lungs ached from breathing the suit's recycled air too fast. But he was gaining on them. 50 meters, 40, 30. A sudden drop in the ground sent him sliding down an icy slope. He could not stop, could not even slow down. The world became a blur of white and gray and his own panicked breathing. Then he hit something soft and alive, and the slide ended in a tumble of limbs and wings and startled squeaking. David lay on his back for a moment, staring up at nothing but white. Something small and cold pressed against his side, then another weight on his legs, a third on his chest, surprisingly heavy for something so young. He turned his head and found himself staring into an eye the size of his fist, pale blue and filled with terror. The hatchling on his chest opened its mouth and made a sound like breaking glass. The one near his legs answered with a similar cry. The third, pressed against his left side near the damaged section of his suit, was silent and shaking. David sat up slowly, moving carefully so as not to frighten them more. The hatchlings scattered back a few feet, their small wings spread in defensive postures. They were beautiful, even in their fear. Their scales had not yet developed the full pearl shimmer of the adults, still showing hints of gray and silver. Their wings were too large for their bodies, giving them an awkward, unfinished look. Each one was about the size of a large dog, with claws that could easily tear through his suit if they panicked. He needed to calm them down. Needed to make them understand he was trying to help. David deactivated his external speakers and began to speak, knowing they could not hear him through the storm but hoping his tone would carry through. Low and soft, the way he had heard Snowmane speak to her young during his observations. The hatchlings watched him with those unnerving pale eyes. One of them, the smallest, took a tentative step forward. Then another. It stretched its neck toward David, nostrils flaring as it tested his scent. Whatever it smelled seemed to confuse it, head tilting in a gesture so similar to its mother that David felt his throat tighten. The small one made a decision. It moved closer and pressed its head against David's chest plate. The other two watched this display of trust and, after a long moment, followed their siblings' lead. Soon all three were huddled against him, seeking warmth and protection from the creature that had chased them through the storm. David checked his power levels and felt his heart sink. The heating elements were draining faster than projected, 6 hours remaining, not 8. The breach in his suit was pulling more power to maintain temperature. And now he had 3 cold-blooded creatures pressed against him, drawing away what little heat his suit could provide. He pulled up his navigation system and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. No signal. The storm was interfering with everything. He had no idea which direction led back to the research station or the dragon caves. He was lost in the worst storm Valthor had seen in decades, with dying equipment and 3 baby dragons depending on him. The rational part of his brain suggested he was going to die here. Probably all 4 of them would die here, frozen solid and buried under ice until the spring melt. The research team would find them eventually, would wonder what the human had been thinking, rushing out into certain death for creatures that were not even his own species. David looked down at the 3 hatchlings. The smallest one had fallen asleep against his chest, exhausted from fighting the wind. The other 2 were watching him with what looked almost like hope, as if they believed this strange warm creature could somehow save them. He adjusted his suit's thermal output, pushing it higher despite the power cost. Then he began to move, picking a direction at random. His arms wrapped around the hatchlings, holding them close. They did not resist, pressing into his warmth with small sounds of relief. The storm screamed around them, but David kept walking. 1 foot in front of the other. There was nothing else to do. He had made his choice when he ran out of that airlock. Now he would see it through to whatever end waited in the white. Snowmane stood at the cave entrance like a statue carved from ice itself. Her mate, Frostclaw, had tried 3 times to pull her deeper into the shelter where the wind could not reach. 3 times she had resisted, her claws digging into stone worn smooth by generations of dragons. Her eyes never left the wall of white that had swallowed her children and the human. The other dragons had given up. She could hear them in the deeper chambers, their low rumbles of grief mixing with the storm's howl. They were mourning already, performing the old rituals for the lost. It was practical, even necessary. In this environment, death came quickly and without warning. To survive, you learned to let go and move forward. That was the way of things on Valthor. But Snowmane had not survived the hunters, had not led her clan across 3 star systems to safety, by accepting what others called inevitable. Something in her ancient blood, something that went deeper than instinct or learned behavior, told her to wait, to watch, to believe. Frostclaw pressed against her side, offering his warmth. He did not try to speak, did not waste energy on empty comfort. He simply stood with her, adding his vigil to hers. Behind them, the younger dragons whispered among themselves. They spoke of the human's foolishness, of how he had thrown away his life for creatures not his own. Some called it noble, others called it stupid. None of them understood why Snowmane refused to mourn. She barely understood it herself. In all her long years, she had seen many species. Some were predators, some prey. Some were clever, some dull. But none had ever done what that human had done. He had run toward danger, toward certain death for her children, not for profit or alliance or debt, simply because they needed help and he could provide it. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it grew worse, the wind speeds increasing until even Snowmane had to brace herself against the cave wall. Ice formed on her scales, making her look like a ghost of herself. Still she watched. Still she waited. Far out in the ice fields, David had found shelter of a sort. A crack in a glacier wall, barely deep enough to be called a cave, but enough to break the wind. He crawled inside, the hatchlings following close behind. The space was so small he had to curl around them, his body forming a barrier between them and the storm. His power levels were critical now. 3 hours remaining. The breach in his suit had grown worse, the seal down to 60%. Cold was seeping in through the damaged section, making his left leg ache with a deep bone-level pain. His fingers were numb despite the heating elements in his gloves. His lips had turned blue, visible in the faint reflection of his helmet display. David knew he was dying. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. Even if the storm ended right now, he did not have enough power to make it back. Even if he knew which direction to go, his body was shutting down from the cold. He had maybe an hour before he lost consciousness, maybe 2 before his core temperature dropped too low to recover. The hatchlings seemed to sense something was wrong. They pressed closer, their small bodies shivering. David realized with distant surprise that they were cold too. Dragon hatchlings could not regulate their body temperature as well as adults. They needed external heat sources. Normally that would be their parents or warm rocks heated by thermal vents, or the sun during Valthor's brief summer days. Now all they had was a freezing human in a failing survival suit. David made a decision. He overrode his suit's safety protocols and diverted all remaining power to the heating elements. The computer screamed warnings at him. This action would drain the battery in less than an hour. Life support would fail. He would have no emergency beacon, no communication, no way to call for help even if help could reach him. But for 1 hour, maybe a bit more, he could provide warmth. Could keep 3 small lives alive a little while longer, maybe long enough for the storm to pass, maybe long enough for them to find their way home. The heating elements flared to life at maximum output. The temperature inside his suit climbed rapidly, almost painfully hot after so long in the cold. David unsealed his helmet, letting the heat escape into the small cave. The hatchlings responded immediately, crowding closer, their shivering easing as warmth filled the space. The smallest one, the one that had first trusted him, climbed directly onto his lap. The other 2 pressed against his sides, their wings partially spread to catch the rising heat. They made soft chirping sounds, comfort noises David recognized from his observations of dragon families. They sounded almost like purring. David wrapped his arms around them, these small perfect creatures who would probably die with him in this frozen crack in the world. His vision was getting blurry, darkness creeping in at the edges. That was not a good sign. His body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the core. He did not have much time left. One of the hatchlings looked up at him with those pale blue eyes. It reached out with one small claw and touched his face, gentle despite the sharpness. The gesture seemed almost human, almost like comfort or gratitude or goodbye. David smiled. If he had to die, at least it was for something that mattered. At least he would not die alone. He pulled the hatchlings closer and let his eyes drift shut. The warmth from his suit surrounded them like a cocoon. Outside, the storm raged on, but in their tiny shelter there was peace. His last conscious thought was a hope that Snowmane would forgive him for not bringing her children home. He had tried. He had tried so hard. The power indicator on his suit blinked once, twice, then went dark. The heating elements faded. And in the cave entrance far away, Snowmane lifted her head as if she had heard something only she could perceive. She made a sound deep in her chest, something between a growl and a song. Then she settled back into her vigil and waited for the dawn. Dawn came slowly to Valthor, the sun a pale disk barely visible through layers of ice crystal clouds. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime during the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow drifts rose like frozen waves, their surfaces sculpted by wind into sharp ridges and smooth valleys. The temperature had dropped even further in the storm's wake, reaching levels that would freeze exposed flesh in seconds. Snowmane had not moved from her position. Ice covered her completely now, coating her scales in a thick shell. From a distance she looked like part of the landscape, another ice formation among many. Only her eyes moved, scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement. Frostclaw had collapsed beside her hours ago, forced to retreat to warmer depths to prevent his own death from exposure. The other dragons had stopped trying to convince her to come inside. They watched from the safety of the inner caves, their silence heavy with grief and resignation. Some had already begun discussing where to establish new nesting grounds, away from this cursed place where the storms came without warning. Then one of the younger dragons made a sound, not grief but confusion. Snowmane's head turned with a crackling of breaking ice. She followed the young one's gaze to a point far out on the ice field where something dark moved against the white. It was too small to be an adult dragon, too slow to be prey. It moved with an awkward, stumbling gait that spoke of exhaustion and pain. Snowmane's eyes, sharper than any human instrument, focused on the distant figure. Her breath caught in her throat. The human, walking toward them. And strapped to his chest and back with torn fabric and cable, barely visible against his white frosted suit, were 3 small shapes. Snowmane launched herself from the cave entrance. Ice shattered and fell away from her body as she moved, her wings spreading wide. Frostclaw's roar echoed from the depths as he sensed her sudden movement. Other dragons rushed forward, crying out in confusion and disbelief. David heard the sound of wings and tried to look up. The movement made his vision spin. He had regained consciousness an hour ago, buried under a pile of sleeping hatchlings, his suit completely dead. The hatchlings had been lying on top of him, sharing their own body heat. Somehow that exchange of warmth had been enough to keep them all alive through the night. He had no idea how long he had walked. His sense of time had dissolved along with most of his other higher functions. He knew only that he needed to move forward, needed to get the hatchlings home. His left leg was completely numb now, possibly frostbitten beyond saving. His fingers would not bend anymore. Ice had formed inside his helmet, making it difficult to breathe, but the hatchlings were alive. They clung to him like baby possums, their claws dug through his suit into the thermal layer beneath. They were cold and frightened, but alive. That was all that mattered. The sound of wings grew louder. David's legs gave out and he fell forward onto his knees. He tried to catch himself, but his arms would not respond. He landed face down in the snow, the impact jarring the hatchlings loose. They tumbled into the drift around him, squeaking in alarm. Then there was a rush of air and a massive shape blocked out the sky. Claws, each as long as David's forearm, reached down with impossible delicacy and lifted him from the snow. He found himself staring into Snowmane's pale blue eyes, so like her children's but ancient beyond measure. She held him as carefully as she would hold an egg, her claws cradling his broken body. Frostclaw landed beside them and immediately moved to gather the hatchlings. They cried out with joy, their small voices mixing with his deep rumbling call. He nuzzled each one, checking them for injury, his relief evident in every movement. The other dragons circled overhead, their calls echoing across the ice, spreading the news of an impossible thing. Snowmane turned and began moving back toward the caves, carrying David with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a massive creature. He could feel warmth radiating from her scales, stored heat from the thermal vents deep in the caves. It seeped into his frozen body, painful at first, then increasingly pleasant. His eyes drifted shut. He woke to find himself in darkness. No, not complete darkness. A soft blue glow came from somewhere nearby, reflecting off crystal formations. He was warm, genuinely warm for the first time in what felt like forever. Something soft was beneath him and around him and covering him. David's eyes adjusted slowly. He was deep inside a cave, but not the outer chambers he had seen during his observations. This was somewhere else, somewhere sacred. The walls were covered in carvings, generations of dragons marking their history in stone. The blue glow came from luminescent fungi that grew in careful patterns along the ceiling. And surrounding him were dragons. Snowmane lay curled around him on one side, her body acting as a living heat source. Frostclaw occupied the other side, his massive bulk blocking any draft that might reach the human. The three hatchlings were piled on top of David's chest, chirping softly in their sleep. Other dragons watched from the edges of the chamber, their eyes glowing in the dim light. David recognized some of them from his observations. They made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of hostility. Instead, they seemed curious, perhaps even respectful. Snowmane's eye opened and fixed on him. She made a low sound, complex and layered with meaning David could not begin to interpret, but the tone was clear enough. She was asking a question. David tried to speak and found his voice would not work. His throat was too damaged from the cold and the recycled air. Instead, he lifted one hand, moving slowly so as not to disturb the sleeping hatchlings, and placed it gently on Snowmane's snout. The scales were warm under his palm, surprisingly smooth. She held perfectly still, allowing the touch. Then slowly, deliberately, she closed her eyes and pressed her head slightly into his hand. It was a gesture of trust, of acceptance, of something that went deeper than words. David felt tears on his face, whether from relief or exhaustion, or the simple, overwhelming emotion of being accepted by these magnificent creatures. He could not say. He left his hand where it was, and Snowmane did not pull away. Around them, the other dragons began to hum, a deep resonant sound that filled the cave and made the crystal formation sing in harmony. It was a sound of welcome, of recognition, of bonds being formed that had never existed before. David closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. He was alive. The hatchlings were alive, and somehow, impossibly, he had found a place among dragons. Recovery was not a quick process. David spent 3 weeks in the dragon sanctuary, drifting in and out of consciousness as his body struggled to heal from the damage. The frostbite on his left leg was severe but not fatal, thanks to the dragon's intervention. They had removed his suit with surprising skill, their claws precise despite their size, and treated his injuries with methods that seemed part medicine and part mystery. Snowmane rarely left his side. When she had to hunt or attend to other duties, Frostclaw or one of the other adults would take her place. But mostly it was her, watching over him with patient eyes, occasionally breathing warm air across his body when his temperature dropped too low. The hatchlings were constant companions, sleeping on and around him, their presence a living blanket. The research station had noticed David's absence within hours of the storm's end. They had sent out search teams, called in favors from passing ships, even requested satellite imaging. But the dragons had made it clear, through carefully positioned bodies and warning flights, that David was not to be disturbed. The research director, a practical woman named Carol Stone, had been faced with an impossible choice. Push the issue and risk the first dragon-human conflict in 20 years, or trust that the creatures knew what they were doing. She chose to trust. But she insisted on proof of life, and the dragons, to everyone's surprise, agreed. Snowmane had carried David to a position where the station's long-range cameras could see him. He had waved, weakly, and spoken a few words into a radio the dragons had retrieved from his abandoned equipment. "I am okay. They are taking care of me. Please give them space." The footage had gone viral across human space within hours. A man barely alive, being tended by creatures that most people only knew from nature documentaries. The albino dragons, previously famous for their isolation and their endangered status, suddenly became the subject of intense public interest. And not the kind of interest the dragons had fled from generations ago. This was different. This was respect. As David grew stronger, he began to explore the deeper parts of the dragon caves. The hatchlings followed him everywhere, chirping protests when he moved too fast, celebrating with small pouncing jumps when he praised their hunting practice. They had named themselves, or perhaps the dragons had named them: Hope, Frost, and Dawn. David was not sure if those were translations or approximations, but they fit. Hope was the smallest and the bravest, always the first to try new things. Frost was thoughtful, watching and learning before acting. Dawn was the mediator, keeping peace between her siblings when their games grew too rough. They were individuals with personalities as distinct as any human child, and David found himself loving them with a fierceness that surprised him. The dragons taught him their language, or at least the parts of it that a human throat could manage. It was a complex system of sounds, gestures, and what David could only describe as electromagnetic signals. He would never speak it fluently, but he learned enough to communicate basic needs and concepts. The dragons in turn learned to understand human speech patterns, though they could not reproduce them. Snowmane was the best teacher. She had patience that seemed infinite, repeating lessons until David grasped them, never showing frustration at his slow progress. Through these lessons, he learned the history of the albino dragons, how they had once numbered in the thousands, spread across multiple worlds, how collectors had hunted them for their beautiful scales, reducing them to barely 100 individuals, how Snowmane's grandmother had led the survivors here, to this frozen moon where beauty was common and survival was hard enough to discourage casual visitors. He learned that the dragons had been watching humans for a long time, trying to decide if they were like the collectors or something different. Most dragons believed humans were just another predator species, dangerous and unpredictable, but a few, like Snowmane, had wondered if perhaps there was more to them. David's actions in the storm had answered that question in a way that no amount of observation could. He had shown them that humans were capable of sacrifice, of putting other lives before their own survival. It was a trait the dragons valued above all others, the foundation of their own society. To risk oneself for the young, even young not of your own blood, was the highest form of honor. One morning, David woke to find the sanctuary filled with more dragons than he had ever seen in one place. They had come from the far caves, from hunting grounds, from solitary meditation spots, all gathered to witness something that Snowmane explained through gesture and simple words. A ceremony. The dragons arranged themselves in a circle with David and the 3 hatchlings at the center. Snowmane and Frostclaw stood closest, their wings partially spread. The blue luminescent fungi on the ceiling seemed to glow brighter. casting everything in an otherworldly light. Snowmane spoke, her voice carrying through the chamber in waves of sound that David felt in his bones. He did not understand all of it, but he caught key concepts: family, clan, forever. The other dragons responded in unison, their voices blending into something that was almost music. Then Snowmane reached out and placed one claw over David's heart. Gently, carefully, she extended one sharp tip and made a small cut. A single drop of blood welled up. At the same time, Frostclaw did the same to himself, a scale parting to reveal the rich blue blood beneath. Snowmane touched the two drops together, mixing human red with dragon blue. The color that resulted was purple, rich and dark. She held up her claw so all could see, and the chamber erupted in sound. Not aggressive, but celebratory. The dragons were singing, David understood. He had been adopted, made part of the clan through the oldest ritual they had. He was no longer an observer, no longer an outsider. He was family. Hope, Frost, and Dawn piled onto him, their happy chirps adding to the noise. Other dragons approached, each touching him briefly with claw or wing, acknowledging the bond. When they were done, Snowmane looked at David with eyes that held something very much like love. She spoke a single word in dragon tongue, one David had learned. Kalithmar, the one who walks through death for others. It was a name, his name, and David accepted it with a full heart. 6 months after the storm, representatives from 12 different human colonies arrived on Valthor. They came in small ships, moving slowly, sending respectful messages ahead. The dragons, after much debate, agreed to meet them, but they insisted on one condition. David must be present, and he must speak for them. The meeting took place in a large cave that the dragons had modified for the occasion. They had cleared space, arranged rocks for seating, even allowed the humans to install temporary heating units. It was a level of accommodation that shocked the diplomats. Dragons did not adapt their spaces for others. That they were doing so now spoke volumes about how much things had changed. David stood between two worlds, dressed in clothes that were part human practical and part dragon ceremonial. Hope, Frost, and Dawn flanked him, now the size of small horses, their scales beginning to show the full pearl shimmer of adults. They had insisted on being present, despite Snowmane's concerns about their youth. "We were there at the beginning," Hope had said in her halting mix of dragon sounds and human words. "We should be here now." Snowmane addressed the gathered humans through David, her words translated as much by emotion and gesture as by language. She spoke of the old days when dragons trusted too easily and paid the price in blood and extinction. She spoke of the long isolation, the fear that had driven them to this frozen moon, and then she spoke of the storm, and a human who had proven that not all of mankind was to be feared. "We thought compassion was unique to dragons," David translated, his voice carrying through the cave. "We thought other species helped only when it benefited them. But this human showed us different. He had nothing to gain from saving our young. He would have died and did nearly die for children not his own. That is the mark of true sentience. Not intelligence or technology, but the willingness to sacrifice for others." The human diplomats listened in respectful silence. Among them was Carol Stone, David's former director, who had fought hard to make this meeting happen. She stood when Snowmane finished speaking. "We have much to learn from you," Carol said, her words careful and sincere. "For too long we have measured advancement by what a species builds or discovers. But perhaps the better measure is what a species is willing to give up, what they protect, what they value beyond their own survival." Frostclaw made a rumbling sound of approval. Other dragons around the cave echoed it, the sound building into something almost like thunder. The proposal that emerged from that meeting was revolutionary. A joint settlement where humans and dragons could live side by side, where each species could learn from the other, not as subject and observer, but as partners. The dragons would teach humans about patience, about long-term thinking, about the delicate balance required to survive in harmony with harsh environments. Humans would share their medical knowledge, their technology, and their unique perspective on solving problems. But more than that, they would share their young. Dragon hatchlings would learn human languages and customs. Human children would learn to understand dragon communication, to respect their long view of time. Hope, Frost, and Dawn would be the first teachers, bridging both worlds with the ease of those who had never known a time when the two were separate. Not all dragons agreed with this plan. Some argued that humans were still too dangerous, too unpredictable, but Snowmane's voice carried weight, earned through generations of keeping the clan alive. And she had seen something in David that convinced her the risk was worth taking. Not all humans were comfortable either. Some called it dangerous to live so close to creatures that could kill them easily, but those voices were drowned out by others who saw the opportunity for what it was. A chance to learn from a species that had survived extinction through wisdom and mutual care. A chance to be better than they had been. The settlement began as a small thing. A few human structures near the dragon caves connected by heated tunnels. A shared medical facility where Dr. Lisa Park worked alongside dragon healers, combining knowledge that saved lives on both sides. A school where children of both species learned together, playing in the snow under the watchful eyes of parents with scales and parents with skin. David moved between both communities easily, comfortable in either. The hatchlings, now teenagers in dragon terms, followed his example. They became ambassadors without meaning to, simply by being themselves. Young dragons who loved human music and learned to operate computers with their claws. Young humans who learned to read dragon emotions through electromagnetic sense, aided by small translation devices. One evening, 2 years after the storm, David stood outside the settlement and watched the sun set over the ice fields. Snowmane found him there, as she often did during these quiet moments. She settled beside him, her bulk blocking the wind, her warmth making the cold bearable. "Do you regret it?" she asked, the words a mix of sound and gesture that David understood perfectly now. "Giving up your old life for this?" David thought about his small apartment on Earth, his career path at the research company, the comfortable, predictable life he had left behind. Then he looked at the settlement, where human children were playing tag with young dragons, where two species that should have remained separate were building something new together. Hope emerged from one of the buildings, saw David and Snowmane, and bounded over with her siblings close behind. They were nearly full-grown now, magnificent and powerful, but they still greeted him with the same enthusiasm they had shown as hatchlings. Dawn knocked him over gently, and soon all three were piled on top of him while he laughed. Snowmane watched this display with what could only be described as amusement. "I think," David said, his voice muffled by dragon wings, "that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The settlement grew. More humans came, drawn by stories of the dragons and the man who had become one of them. More dragons ventured down from the high caves, curious about these strange creatures who valued life as much as dragons did. And at the center of it all was the memory of a storm, and 3 small lives, and a choice made without hesitation. Years later, when human children asked about the founding of the settlement, they were told the story of David Reed, who walked into death and came back with hope. Dragon hatchlings learned the same story, told in their own way about the first human to prove himself worthy of the ancient name Caleth Mar. But David himself rarely spoke of that day. When pressed, he would only say that he had done what anyone would do, that saving lives in need was not heroic, but simply the minimum requirement for calling yourself sentient. The dragons knew better. They remembered, and they taught their young to remember. Some bonds are forged in comfort and peace, but the strongest bonds, the ones that change worlds, are forged in storms. And when the storms come, you learn who will stand with you in the cold, who will risk everything for those who cannot save themselves. Humans, the dragons learned, would come back from the storm carrying those they had sworn to protect. Every single time, and that made all the difference.